When I walked into the restaurant that night, my daughter smiled like forgiveness was on the menu. Two lawyers sat beside her, sharp suits, sharper eyes, and a contract folder laid out like a trap disguised in silk. The chandeliers of Chateau Elara glittered above us, throwing gold light over the table, over her diamond earrings, over my reflection in the glass. Dad, Elena said softly, "Tonight's about peace." I smiled. Not because I believed her, but because I already knew what this was. "That's funny," I said, pulling out a chair across from her. "I brought someone too." Their smiles faltered for a second, the first crack in the porcelain calm. I didn't let the silence linger. I've learned in 75 years that sometimes the quiet before the storm says more than thunder ever could. 3 weeks earlier, I was standing on the terrace of my estate in Napa Valley, watching the sunset pour itself into the vineyards below. I could smell the oak barrels from the cellar, the distant hum of construction from the new hotel site. That hotel, my final project, was supposed to be the crown jewel of Archer Holdings. 40 years of blood, grit, and risk had built it. I'm Raymond Archer, 75 years old. I started as a civil engineer, patching up cracked bridges along California's coast. By 50, I owned half a dozen luxury resorts. By 60, I'd built an empire worth more than I'd ever dreamed, but never more than I could manage. Or so I thought. Elena arrived that evening in a white suit, her heels silent against the marble. She carried a leather folder and an expression that didn't belong to the little girl who used to race through these vineyards with scraped knees and a plastic tiara. "Dad, we need to talk," she said. Her tone was polite, the kind people use before a coup. I motioned toward the terrace. "Talk." She placed the folder on the table between the wine glasses. "It's time for you to retire. You've worked enough. Let me take over." I opened the folder. Contracts. Transfer of executive authority. Signature lines with my name already typed in bold. "Retire," I repeated. "You think legacy has an expiration date. Legacy doesn't matter if you run it into the ground," she said quickly. "Dad, your ways are outdated. We can triple profits with the right investors. Patrick's team already has a plan." Patrick. My son-in-law always had a plan, and every one of them smelled like perfume and gasoline, sweet first, deadly later. I shut the folder and looked her in the eye. "Elena, you don't build something like this by selling it piece by piece. You build it by standing on it, guarding it, protecting what it means." Her lips trembled, then steadied. "You're clinging to the past." Maybe I said, glancing out toward the endless rows of vines, but the past is what holds the ground steady. The air between us thickened. She sighed, the kind of sigh that carries an entire generation's impatience. "Fine. But don't be surprised when people start calling for new leadership." I watched her walk away through the archway of stone and ivy, her silhouette sharp against the setting sun. She didn't look back. I could already feel the chill of something breaking, something colder than business. When she was gone, I poured myself a glass of Merlot from the 2002 vintage, the one her mother used to favor, and let it breathe. The vineyard below shimmered under dusk, every vine lined like a soldier waiting for orders. The sweetest grapes come from the toughest soil, I thought. Maybe families are the same. That night, I didn't call my lawyer. I didn't call my accountant. I walked down to the wine cellar, touched the barrel-stamped Archer Legacy No. 1, and told myself quietly, "They can try. But this legacy isn't for sale. I've weathered market crashes, lawsuits, even a wildfire that nearly took half my estate. But nothing burns hotter than betrayal wearing your own bloodline. Before we go on, tell me, where are you watching from tonight?" Napa, Dallas, maybe somewhere oceans away. Drop your city in the comments below. I'd love to know where this story finds you. Because the storm that was about to hit me, it didn't start in the market. It started right there at my own family table. It started with a phone call that wasn't meant for me. I was in my study that morning, reviewing blueprints for the new Vineyard Hotel when the intercom from the front office crackled. Mr. Archer, my assistant, said hesitantly, "Your daughter's on the line, but she doesn't know you're patched in yet." I didn't speak. I just listened. "Elena Archer," she said briskly, her tone sharper than wine on an empty stomach. "Yes, Patrick, I spoke to the board. They're nervous, but they'll follow if we make it look like Dad's unwell. Send the draft of that medical note. We'll announce a transition plan next week." A pause. Then Patrick's voice, smooth, poisonous. "Once he signs the proxy, we can handle the rest. Don't hesitate, babe. You've got this." My chest tightened, but not from age. From clarity. I hung up quietly. For a long minute, I just stared at the vineyards outside my window, the same fields I'd planted for her future. The morning light turned the grape leaves gold, but for the first time in years, it didn't look beautiful. It looked temporary. By noon, rumors had already started swirling. My accountant texted me asking if I was feeling better. The estate manager said Elena had called a wellness audit. And by afternoon, the Wine and Wealth Journal published a small note online: transition expected at Archer Holdings as founder's health reportedly declines. Health. Decline. I almost laughed. I still ran 6 miles every morning. I still carried my own suitcases. But truth in business is never about facts. It's about who tells the story first. That evening, I met with my lawyer, David Rowe, at the cigar lounge of the Vintners Club. He was an old Navy man like me with a face carved by salt and wisdom. "They're setting the stage, Ray," he said, exhaling smoke slowly. "If they get 3 board members to sign, they can claim incapacity transfer. Once that happens, your signature won't matter." I sipped my bourbon eyes on the amber swirl. "So they want me to look unfit. They'll get a doctor's note, a whisper campaign, and a press leak," David said. "Patrick's done this before with another company?" I checked. I smiled faintly. "Then we let them build the perfect lie." He frowned. "You're not fighting back yet." "Not yet," I said. "A storm needs to gather before you redirect the wind." When I got home, the housekeeper handed me a sealed envelope that had been delivered by courier. No return address. Inside, a printed draft of an official statement already signed with my forged signature. After careful thought, I, Raymond Archer, will step down as chairman to allow new leadership. The audacity almost impressed me. Later that night, I walked down to the old chapel on the property, a place my late wife Claire used to sit when the world felt too loud. I lit one candle, watched the flame shiver, and whispered into the quiet stone air, "Lord, I've fought storms, fire, and greed, but nothing like this. Give me patience stronger than pride, and wisdom greater than wrath." The words echoed faintly against the stained glass walls. It wasn't desperation, it was a pact. Outside the vineyard was dark rows of vines like soldiers waiting for orders. I looked up at the stars above Napa's hills and felt something old stirring in me, not anger, not fear, but a kind of calm that only comes before decisive war. When I returned to the house, the phone buzzed again. This time a new email from Elena A., subject official transition meeting. The meeting was set for Monday. I smiled just a little. The board thought they were walking into a handover. What they didn't know was that I had already started building something stronger than their ambition proof. Faith doesn't mean surrendering the fight. It means standing steady while the storm tries to make you bow. And as I turned off the light, I whispered to myself, patience isn't silence. It's preparation. The morning of that so-called transition meeting, I woke before sunrise. The vineyards outside were still wrapped in fog, the world holding its breath. That silence before daylight, most people call it peace. I've always called it planning time. I brewed my coffee the way Claire used to, black, no sugar, and opened the folder I'd spent all weekend building. Inside were screenshots, account statements, and transaction trails that didn't belong to me. They belonged to Patrick Vance, my daughter's husband, and they led somewhere dark. The private investigator I'd hired, a quiet man from Sacramento named Cooper, had been thorough. Sir, he'd said over the phone, your son-in-law's portfolio is a house of cards. Offshore accounts, fake shell funds, and one big hole he's trying to fill fast. How big, I asked. 8 figures. Maybe more. He's desperate. That was all I needed to know. Desperate men make stupid moves, especially when they think they're smarter than everyone else. I drove into town that morning in my silver Mercedes, the one with a dent Claire used to call my humility mark. On the passenger seat sat a flash drive containing every file Cooper had found. By the time I reached the Vintners Club for the board meeting, I had made up my mind I wasn't going to confront Elena or Patrick, not yet. I'd let them dig their own grave first. Inside the club's private hall, everything looked polished to the point of absurdity. Mahogany tables, gold-rimmed glasses, the faint smell of expensive perfume and false promises. Elena stood near the projector, looking like success wrapped in silk. Patrick leaned casually against the bar, laughing with 2 board members who once swore loyalty to me. Dad Elena greeted her voice, honey-coated and hollow. Glad you could make it. I nodded once, taking my seat at the head of the table, the same chair I'd occupied for 30 years. The lawyers distributed printed slides while the projector flickered to life. Gentleman Patrick began smoothly. Today we'll review performance metrics and outline our modernization strategy for Archer Holdings. This transition represents not only growth, but a generational leap forward. He spoke in buzzwords: scalability, synergy, vertical expansion. I'd built real things, bridges, buildings, livelihoods. He built sentences that sold illusions. Halfway through his speech, he presented a graph, one showing a 25% decline in profit margins under outdated leadership. I looked around the table, watching eyes shift nervously. The graph was clean, colorful, and completely false. Those numbers are wrong, I said quietly. Patrick smiled, teeth white as marble. They're verified, Ray. Third-party audit. Third party, I echoed. Who hired them? Independent consultants, he replied, but his gaze flickered for half a second, too fast for anyone else to notice, but not for me. I stood slowly, buttoning my jacket. You want modernization, I said evenly. You think that means tearing down what was built with integrity. But modernization without honesty is just fraud in a new suit. Elena stiffened. Dad, please don't do this here. I'm not, I said, picking up my folder. You are. The room went still. Even Patrick stopped smiling. Then deliberately, I pushed the folder toward the center of the table. Here's my modernization, I said. Bank statements, offshore accounts, false consulting contracts signed by Mr. Vance, all siphoning money from Archer subsidiaries for the last 6 months. A few board members exchanged startled looks. One of them, Greg Thomas, cleared his throat. If that's true, it's true, I interrupted. And verified by forensic accountants. The question isn't whether Archer Holdings needs new leadership. It's whether it can survive the current one. Patrick tried to recover his voice, brittle. These accusations are outrageous. My firm's finances have nothing to do with this company. I leaned closer. Then you won't mind when I hand this to the SEC tomorrow morning? The color drained from his face. Elena slammed her tablet shut. Enough, she snapped. You're destroying your own reputation. No, I said, calm as the tide. I'm saving what's left of yours. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Only the hum of the projector filled the air. Then I picked up my folder and turned to the door. You've had your meeting, I said. Now it's my turn. Outside the valley, sun had burned through the fog, spilling gold over the rows of grapes. I stood there for a long time, breathing in the scent of earth and oak. Every man faces a moment when family turns into business, and business turns into battle. That morning mine began. By the next morning, the story had already reached the papers. The Napa Valley Tribune ran a headline that made me spit out my coffee. Archer Holdings faces internal power struggle amid family dispute. They quoted an anonymous source, no doubt one of Patrick's pet journalists, saying I'd been combative and confused in the meeting. Confused. That word again. The same lie they'd been planting for weeks. I set the paper down and stared out at the fog lifting over the vineyards. A hawk circled lazily overhead, gliding in wide, patient arcs. Patience, I reminded myself, beats panic every time. At 9 a.m., my lawyer David Rowe called. Ray, the board's in chaos. 2 members are demanding a special audit. Patrick's furious. He's threatening to sue you for defamation. Good, I said. Let him. David chuckled dryly. You always did enjoy a good chess match. This isn't chess, I replied. It's salvage work. By noon, the air around Archer Holdings buzzed with nervous energy. Whispers in the hallway. Deleted emails. Legal assistants printing forms twice, then shredding the wrong copies. They were scrambling, and that's exactly where I wanted them. I spent the afternoon in my study sorting documents when a knock sounded on the door. My housekeeper handed me a letter sealed with gold foil. Inside, an embossed invitation. Dinner, Chateau Ilara. Let's talk, just the 2 of us. Elena, I read it twice slowly. That night, I poured myself a small glass of bourbon and stood by the fireplace, weighing the paper between my fingers. Just the 2 of us, she'd written. The same girl who once asked me to help her build a treehouse now wanted a private dinner to make peace. I didn't buy it. Not after the forged contracts, not after the staged headlines. But you can't expose liars until you let them speak. I called David. She wants dinner. Careful, he warned. If Patrick's behind it, you can expect lawyers in the shadows. Then I'll bring light. He sighed. You're enjoying this, aren't you? Not at all, I said. I'm just ready for it to end. After hanging up, I walked out onto the terrace. The night smelled of wet soil and oak. Somewhere down in the valley, the river murmured faintly. I could almost hear Claire's voice in it, calm, steady, reminding me to move with purpose, not anger. For the first time in weeks, I slept through the night. The next morning, the phone rang just as I was pouring my coffee. The screen flashed, Elena. Dad, she said, her tone soft, too soft. I know things got tense. But we can fix this. Patrick won't be there. No lawyers. Just us. Dinner tomorrow night at 8. Chateau Elara, I asked. She hesitated a beat. Yes. It's private. Of course it is, I said evenly. Dad, she continued, let's be civil, please. We're still family. Family doesn't hide knives and napkins, I said, but sure I'll come. Her sigh of relief was audible through the line. Thank you. I promise this is for peace. Peace, I repeated, and then hung up. The phone clicked, but something told me she hadn't actually disconnected. I kept the receiver near my ear. Patrick's voice bled faintly through the line, his whisper a serpent in silk. Good job, babe. Lawyers will be at the next table. He'll sign once he sees the documents. Make it sound like reconciliation. Elena exhaled sharply. And if he doesn't, then we go public with the confusion narrative. We'll corner him. He'll fold. I let the call run a few more seconds, then hung up for real. The room was quiet except for the ticking of the old wall clock. I stood there calm, not angry, just awake. I looked toward the mantel where Claire's Bible rested, its leather cracked from years of her hands. I brushed the cover gently. Faith isn't blind, I whispered. It's seeing clearly and still choosing not to hate. The next 24 hours would decide everything, but they'd forgotten one thing. When a man spends 50 years building foundations, he also learns how to tear them down quietly, precisely, and only when the structure's rotten inside. If you're still with me through this storm, type 1 in the comments. Let me know you're still watching. Because the dinner that followed changed everything. The morning before the dinner, Napa Valley looked almost too calm, sunlight spilling over the vineyards, the air carrying that sweet mix of oak earth and promise. But peace, I've learned, can be camouflage for a battlefield. I spent the early hours in my home office, the large glass windows open to the valley breeze, the kind Claire used to say smelled like second chances. On my desk sat 3 things: a flash drive, a printed folder of financial records, and a small silver pocket watch that had belonged to my father. The hands had stopped years ago, frozen at 7:52 p.m., the same time the fire broke out at my first construction site back in 1979. I'd kept it as a reminder, even the worst disasters can rebuild better foundations. That morning, I was rebuilding again, but not with bricks, with truth. The night before, I'd called Aaron Holt, a name Patrick probably thought had been erased from his past. 8 years ago, they were partners in a fund that went belly up under mysterious circumstances. Aaron lost everything: home, savings, and health. Patrick walked away untouched, whispering about bad market timing. When Aaron picked up the phone, his voice was low and worn, but sharp. "Archer," he said, "been waiting for this call." "I assume you still have the files," I replied. "Everyone," he said. "Bank transfers, shell companies, Cayman accounts, the works. Never had a reason to use them until now." "You've got one," I said simply. We met later that afternoon at a quiet coffee shop off Silverado Trail. He arrived in a faded jacket, hair streaked with gray eyes, burning with quiet anger. I bought him black coffee and 2 hours of silence to tell his story. Patrick's scheme had been clever, too clever for a man without morals. He'd moved money between fake shell companies, used consulting invoices to drain investment funds, then buried the paper trail through dummy startups. Aaron had caught on, but Patrick's legal team buried him alive with lawsuits until he folded. Aaron slid a manila envelope across the table. "Everything's in here. You'll find your son-in-law's fingerprints on every false claim. I didn't open it. Not yet. You want revenge? I asked. He shook his head. No, just balance. Balance. That was the word. That night, back at the estate, I sat on the veranda as the sun sank behind the hills, painting the sky, in that deep red hue Claire used to call the color of endings. I poured myself a glass of our 2010 Merlot and opened Aaron's folder. Each page confirmed what I already knew: wire transfers, false audits, even the same forged digital signature used in the transition contracts. Patrick's greed wasn't just desperate, it was patterned. And patterns always lead back to their maker. I arranged everything into one clean chronological file and uploaded copies onto a secure flash drive. Then I called David, my lawyer. David, I said, I'll need you at the Chateau Elara tonight, not at the table, in the back room with the restaurant's manager. Quietly. He hesitated. You're sure about this? Positive. I'm not walking into an ambush. I'm setting one. After the call, I went upstairs and changed. Navy suit, gold cufflinks, the same silk tie I wore the day I opened the first Archer Hotel. The fabric still carried the faint scent of oak and old ambition. I looked at myself in the mirror, an old man, yes, but not a defeated one. I placed the flash drive into my inside pocket beside a folded note that read, "Integrity is the only inheritance worth leaving." Before leaving, I paused by the framed photograph of Claire in the hallway, her hand resting on my shoulder, her smile steady, fearless. You always told me, I whispered, don't fight for control, fight for truth. I'm listening now. Outside, the valley shimmered under twilight, the air turning cool. The vines stood in perfect lines like witnesses waiting for confession. I got into the car engine, humming low headlights cutting through the winding road. Tomorrow's headlines would talk about the dinner, the documents, the downfall. But tonight was about something bigger. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about restoring the balance my daughter had broken. By 8 o'clock, the sky above Napa had turned the color of old wine, dark, still waiting. The Chateau Elara stood like a glass palace at the edge of the vineyard, every window glowing gold against the valley's dusk. From the outside, it looked peaceful. But I knew better. Some dinners aren't meant for reconciliation. They're meant for exposure. The maitre d' led me into the private dining room, where Elena and Patrick were already seated. 2 lawyers flanked them, their briefcases stacked neatly beside the table like obedient dogs. Dad, Elena said, rising with that trained grace she'd perfected over years of boardrooms and banquets. I'm glad you came. I nodded once, slipping into the chair across from her. You said this was about peace. It is, Patrick said smoothly, pouring me a glass of Pinot Noir without asking. Peace, closure, and what's fair for everyone. I glanced at the paperwork already laid out before me, thick contracts bound in blue ribbon, my name printed neatly on every page. Voluntary transfer of ownership, the top line read. Go ahead, Patrick said, his voice silky. Review it. Once you sign, we can move forward without dragging this through the courts. I picked up the first page, skimmed it, then set it down carefully. That's funny, I said quietly. You talk about moving forward like we're not already knee-deep in deceit. Elena stiffened. Dad, please don't start. I looked at her, and for a moment I didn't see the cold executive she'd become. I saw the little girl who used to steal grapes off the vines when she thought I wasn't looking. The one who once said she'd never let money change her. Then I saw the lie in her eyes, and the pity turned to steel. You said this dinner was about peace, I said. But I already heard the plan. Lawyers at the next table. Coercion, public smear campaign if I refuse. I suppose that's your idea of family. Patrick's fork froze midair. You're mistaken. I smiled faintly. No, Patrick. You are. I reached for my phone, pressed one button. The side door opened. Aaron Holt stepped in carrying a leather briefcase. His presence sucked the air out of the room like a sudden draft. Patrick went pale. You, Aaron, interrupted, voice steady. Evening. Hope I'm not interrupting dessert. Elena looked from me to him, confusion clouding her face. Who is this someone, I said, who's been waiting 8 years for this moment? Aaron opened the briefcase, laying out file after file, bank records, transaction logs, digital correspondence. The lawyers leaned forward, eyes narrowing as they recognized what they were seeing, the skeleton of Patrick's empire, every bone numbered and named. Aaron continued calmly. These are records from Vance Capital's collapse. Every transfer that drained investor funds. Every shell account used to launder the losses. And he tapped one folder, this one special. It ties directly to Archer Holdings. Same IP address. Same signature forgery. Patrick's jaw clenched. You can't prove that's mine. Aaron smirked. Already did. Digital timestamp doesn't lie. But people do. One of the lawyers whispered something to the other. Papers shuffled. The room's confidence cracked like a cheap wine glass. Elena's voice broke. Patrick, tell me this isn't true. He didn't answer. I stood, placing both hands on the table, voice low and steady. You wanted control, Patrick. You wanted to inherit something you didn't build. But you built this instead, a fraud so obvious even the soil beneath this vineyard could smell it. Patrick's face twisted a mix of rage and panic. You can't destroy me, old man. I'm not destroying you, I said, leaning closer. I'm uncovering you. One of the lawyers finally stood, face pale. Mr. Vance, I advise you to stop talking. Elena turned towards me, tears streaking the foundation she'd so carefully applied. Dad, I didn't know. I swear. I met her gaze, tired but firm. You didn't want to know. There's a difference. The silence after that was long enough to count your own heartbeat in it. Then quietly, I gathered my coat. As I turned toward the door, I said what needed to be said. Integrity doesn't need applause. It just needs time. Outside, the air was crisp, the valley quiet again. The moonlight fell across the rows of vines, glinting faintly on the glass of the restaurant behind me. I took one last look over my shoulder and whispered, Lord, may justice fall as gentle as rain, but firm enough to cleanse. And as I walked toward my car, the night wind carried the faint sound of shattering glass, pride, illusion. It didn't matter which. The truth had finally done its work. By sunrise, the valley was buzzing. You could almost hear the whispers floating through the vines. It started with a phone alert, breaking news, investor Patrick Vance under federal investigation. Then came the calls. First from David, then from reporters, then from bankers who suddenly remembered my number. Ray David said, his voice half disbelief, half triumph, it's everywhere. The SEC just reopened Patrick's old case. Someone leaked the files, every offshore account, every transfer, every shell company tied to him. Someone, I repeated, pouring coffee slowly. Must have been a man with a sense of timing. He laughed softly. You sure you're not enjoying this? I set the mug down. Justice isn't joy, David. It's balance. That morning, The Napa Herald ran a headline in bold: Patrick Vance exposed in multi-million-dollar fraud, Archer Holdings cleared of allegations. Below it was a photo of Patrick leaving a courthouse, his once perfect suit, wrinkled eyes hollow. Elena didn't appear beside him. She hadn't been seen since that dinner. The first call from her came 2 days later. Her voice was quiet, shaky. "Dad, they froze our accounts. Patrick's gone. I never meant for it to go this far." I let her speak, her words tumbling out in half-truths and panic. "He promised it was legal. He said you'd never understand modern business." "Stop," I said gently. "Don't insult yourself with excuses." Silence stretched, then softly she whispered, "What happens now?" "What happens now," I said, looking out the window toward the workers pruning vines under the sun, "is consequence. And maybe, if you let it, redemption." She cried quietly before hanging up. I didn't call her back. Some lessons can't be taught in conversation. They have to be lived. Over the next week, the board met twice. David handled the legal fallout with the precision of a surgeon. The lawyers who'd backed Patrick resigned. Investors returned cautiously, shaking my hand with that convenient amnesia rich people have when the tide turns in your favor. During the final meeting, one of the younger board members, a man half my age but wise enough to watch first and speak second, asked Mr. Archer, "What will you do now?" "Retire," I smiled. "No." "Rebuild." He frowned. "But the company's fine. The brand's stronger than ever." "Not the company," I said. "The purpose." That evening I walked through the old vineyard road Claire and I used to stroll after long days. The sky was a slow burn of orange and lavender, and the smell of crushed grapes lingered faintly in the air. I stopped beside the chapel, the one where I'd once prayed for patience, and unlocked the small iron gate. Inside, the candle I'd lit weeks ago still sat there, burned halfway down. I knelt not as a victor, but as a man who'd finally learned that peace costs more than pride. "Lord," I said quietly, "thank you for the storm. It showed me what was worth anchoring to." When I stepped back outside, my phone buzzed again. A text from David. "Press wants a statement." What should I tell them? I typed one line. "Tell them integrity doesn't expire." That's all. The next morning, Forbes published a feature titled "The Archer Principle: How One Man Saved His Empire Without Losing His Soul." I didn't read it. Instead, I spent the day meeting with vineyard workers, not investors. I told them about the new fund I was launching, a foundation for young engineers and builders who wanted to create something real, something lasting. "Money builds roofs," I said, "but integrity builds shelter." They nodded, and for the first time in months, I saw real smiles, not the boardroom kind. As the day ended, I stood at the edge of the vines, wind brushing the gray from my hair, and thought, revenge is loud. Justice whispers, and faith doesn't forget. Tomorrow the rebuilding would begin, but tonight the balance was finally restored. A year can change the shape of everything, even grief, even pride. 12 months after the scandal, Napa Valley looked alive again. The vineyards had thickened, the new hotel finally stood completed on the southern ridge, its glass walls catching the morning light like calm water. But the name carved above the entrance wasn't Archer Holdings anymore. It read, "The Clare Foundation." I'd sold off half the resort shares and poured the profits into a scholarship fund for engineers, craftsmen, and single parents trying to start over. The rest went to building trade schools across California, honest places for people who knew the value of work that leaves dirt on your hands. Reporters called it philanthropy. I called it a recalibration. That morning, I stood beside Aaron Holt, the man who had once been buried under Patrick's fraud, and now wore a suit again, back straight, eyes clear. He ran the foundation's day-to-day operations. Watching him shake hands with the first class of scholarship recipients, I felt something loosen inside me, the kind of quiet relief you don't get from winning, only from healing. "You ever miss the old days?" Aaron asked, glancing toward the hotel. "Only the parts that smelled like sawdust and sweat," I said with a half smile. "Not the marble tables and wine tastings." He chuckled. "Guess we both learned expensive lessons." We stood for a moment, letting the breeze roll through the rows of vines, carrying the scent of ripening fruit and promise. Somewhere behind us, a choir from the local church sang faintly a dedication ceremony, nothing grand but honest. Later that afternoon, Elena arrived. I hadn't seen her in nearly a year. She stepped out of a modest black sedan, no luxury car, no entourage, no jewelry heavy enough to bend her neck. Just a plain gray dress and the same uncertain eyes she had as a child when she'd broken her mother's favorite vase. "Dad," she said quietly. "Elena." For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then she took a hesitant step forward, holding out a thin white envelope. "I wanted you to have this," she said. "It's a letter of resignation from the board. I shouldn't have been there in the first place. I took the envelope but didn't open it. You could have sent it by email. I needed to say it in person." Her voice shook. I was blinded by fear of losing what I thought was mine. I see now it never was. The wind moved between us, cool and steady. "Elena," I said finally, "you didn't lose anything worth keeping." Her eyes glistened. "Can you forgive me?" I studied her face, the exhaustion, the humility, the fragile sincerity. I thought of Claire again, the way she used to whisper, "Forgiveness doesn't erase truth. It just makes room for it." I nodded slowly. Forgiveness isn't forgetting Elena. It's letting time do its work. So, yes, but it's a long road back. She exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for a year. "That's fair." Before she left, she looked up at the engraved letters above the hotel. "The Claire Foundation," she murmured. "Mom would have loved that." I smiled softly. "She already does." As her car disappeared down the gravel path, I walked back toward the main building. Inside, the lobby was filled with framed photos of students, workers, families who'd received grants. Every face was a small restoration, a reminder that even the ugliest betrayals can become the soil for something honest to grow. That evening, I sat on the veranda with a cup of coffee, not wine. The sunset draped itself across the valley, washing the vines in gold. The sound of distant laughter floated up from the dormitory courtyard, where new apprentices were celebrating their first day. It wasn't the empire I'd planned to build, but it was the legacy I was meant to leave. I closed my eyes, the cool air brushing across my face, and whispered, "Thank you, Lord, for quiet victories and second chances." The peace that followed wasn't loud, but it was real, the kind that stays. There's a particular kind of stillness that only comes to a man who's finished the hardest work of his life. It doesn't arrive with applause or headlines. It just settles quietly in your chest one morning, like a sigh that finally turns into peace. That morning, I sat in the courtyard of the Claire Foundation, a cup of black coffee cooling beside me. The vineyard stretched beyond the gates, green and gold under the early sun. Workers passed by with laughter in their voices. The sound used to make me think of deadlines and deliveries. Now it just sounded like life continuing without my permission, and I liked that. A young woman approached clipboard in hand, nervous but bright-eyed. Her name was Marisol Vega, a first-year engineering student from Sacramento, one of our newest scholarship recipients. "Mr. Archer," she said carefully, "the class wanted to thank you. They're working on their final projects for the solar irrigation system and, well, they named it Project Claire." I smiled, the kind that aches a little before it warms you. "That's kind of them," I said. "Make sure they build it to outlast all of us." She laughed. "That's the plan, sir." Then she hesitated. "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "What made you forgive your daughter after everything?" Her question landed softly, but it lingered. I took a long breath, letting the sunlight touch my face before answering. "Because," I said slowly, "hate is too expensive for an old man. It takes everything and gives nothing back." She nodded thoughtfully, thanked me again, and walked away toward the workshops, where hammers rang against steel. After she left, I turned my attention to the camera crew setting up across the courtyard. David had convinced me to film a short message, something for the Foundation's anniversary. A legacy video, he'd called it. I just called it my last report. They rolled the camera, and I began without notes. "My name is Raymond Archer," I said, my voice steady. 50 years ago, I built a company from the dust of Napa Valley. I believed success was about control. The tighter you held it, the stronger it stayed. But time and loss taught me something different. Success isn't control. It's continuity. It's what keeps growing when your name no longer matters. I paused, glancing toward the distant hills, remembering the house where Claire and I once dreamed, the daughter who'd lost her way, the vineyard that nearly became a battlefield. "Money can build you roofs," I continued, "but integrity builds shelter. And faith," I looked into the lens, "faith builds peace. Not the kind that makes headlines, but the kind that lets you sleep at night." The cameraman's eyes softened as he gave me a small nod. We finished in one take. Later, I watched a rough cut of the video on his tablet. At the end, they'd added an old photo I hadn't seen in years, Claire and me standing in front of our first hotel. I was holding a hammer. She was holding my arm. Neither of us knew how many storms were waiting down the road. I sat there a long time after they left the courtyard, slowly emptying until only the wind and the hum of bees remained. Somewhere behind me, the chapel bell rang 6 times. I thought of Elena then. She'd written me a letter last month, a real one, handwritten, not typed. She said she'd started volunteering at the Foundation's mentorship program, teaching finance to kids from underprivileged schools. "Trying to make up for the harm I caused," she wrote. I'd read that letter at least a dozen times. Not because it erased what happened, but because it proved redemption was still possible even for her. Even for me. The sun was sinking now, gold bleeding into violet across the sky. I leaned back in my chair, the old pocket watch in my hand, its hands still frozen at 7:52. Time doesn't move for everything. Some moments, like forgiveness, stay exactly where they belong, and that, I realized, was what legacy really meant. Not the buildings, not the money, but the light that keeps shining long after you stop tending the fire. The sun was slipping behind the western ridge when I stepped out onto the veranda one last time. The air carried that soft Napa sweetness, grapes, ripening cedar, burning from some distant farmhouse, the hum of an evening that no longer needed me to keep it running. I'd spent the day visiting the new apprentices' dormitory. They'd hung their drawings on the walls, designs for bridges, solar pumps, and even a suspension walkway they called the Archer Line. I didn't tell them that name made my throat tighten. Some legacies are better discovered by those who build them. Now, as twilight bled across the vineyard, I took my seat in the old rocking chair that had once belonged to Claire. The wood creaked the same way it had on the nights she read aloud, while I sketched hotel blueprints by the fire. I could almost hear her voice, steady, teasing, full of life. A quiet knock came at the doorframe. It was Elena. She'd stopped by more often lately, not out of guilt anymore, but presence, that calm, patient rhythm families fall back into once the shouting ends. She looked different now. No makeup, no pretense, just the woman she might have become if ambition hadn't blinded her. "Dad," she said, leaning against the post. "Aaron told me the foundation's expanding to Nevada. You never stop, do you?" I smiled faintly. "You can't stop something that's finally going the right direction." She sat on the steps below me, watching the last of the sun melt into the vines. "I watched your video today," she said softly. "The one for the foundation. The part about faith." She hesitated. It made me cry. I chuckled. "Good. Maybe someone out there needed to hear it." She turned toward me. "You still believe after everything that happened?" I took a long breath. The air was cool, the light fading gold. "Faith isn't a deal, sweetheart," I said. "It's a direction. You don't lose it when life goes wrong, you follow it until life makes sense again." She nodded slowly, her eyes glistening. "I used to think faith was weakness." "So did I admitted. Until it was the only thing left standing." We sat in silence, the kind that doesn't demand anything. The sky deepened into indigo stars, blinking awake one by one. Somewhere down the slope, the wind brushed through the vines like an old hymn. "Dad," she said quietly, "thank you for forgiving me." I reached forward, resting a hand on her shoulder. "Thank you for asking." She smiled, stood and kissed my forehead before heading down the path toward her car. The headlights swept briefly across the vineyard rows, then disappeared, leaving me alone with the crickets and the soft ticking of my father's pocket watch. I looked down at it, still frozen at 7:52, and finally understood. That fire all those years ago, the one that stopped the watch, had burned away everything but the truth. Every loss since had just polished it brighter. I tilted my face toward the sky. The first star hung low above the horizon. "Thank you, Lord," I whispered, "for calm seas and for storms that taught me how to steer." Then I laughed softly, because after 75 years I'd realized that justice doesn't roar and peace doesn't shout. They come like the evening, slow, certain, undeniable. Inside the house, the lights from the foundation glowed across the valley, like constellations built by human hands, steady, humble, and alive. I thought of the apprentices working late, of Elena helping with the scholarships, of every bridge still waiting to be built. Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what keeps growing when you finally rest. I closed my eyes, the chair creaking gently beneath me, and breathed in the scent of earth and grace. "Truth," I murmured, "always finds its way home." If you believe that too, subscribe to Brian's Story, share this video, and tell me in the comments, what would you have done if it were your family? Because sometimes the quiet truth can be louder than any revenge.